was a cold, rainy night, and Emily was exhausted after a long day of studying at the library. The clock on her phone blinked 11:45 p.m. as she requested an Uber to take her back to her apartment. Her usual Uber rides were uneventful, and she expected nothing different this time. The app notified her that her driver, John, was 3 minutes away. As the car approached, she noticed it was an older model sedan with a slightly worn appearance. The driver, a man in his late 40s with deep-set eyes and a blank expression, barely acknowledged her as she got in. The dim interior light flickered as the door shut, adding an unsettling atmosphere to what should have been a routine ride. Emily slid into the back seat, texting her roommate to let her know she was on her way home. The driver started the car and pulled into the street without a word. Usually, drivers at least offered a polite greeting or asked about her day, but John remained eerily silent. Emily shrugged it off, attributing it to the late hour, and turned her attention back to her phone. As the car rolled through the rain-slicked streets, Emily began to notice oddities in John's driving. He would brake suddenly at green lights, only to accelerate abruptly moments later. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the worn leather. Every so often, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, locking onto hers for just a second too long. Feeling uneasy, Emily decided to keep her focus on her phone, typing out a message to her roommate. "Driver's kinda weird. Should be home in 15 minutes. As she hit send, the car took an unexpected turn. She glanced up at her GPS and realized they were no longer following the mapped route. "This isn't the way home," Emily said, her voice tinged with nervousness. John didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let out a low chuckle, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. His lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile that sent chills down Emily's spine. "Shortcut," he finally muttered, his voice gravelly and detached. Emily didn't buy it. She had taken this route dozens of times and knew there was no shortcut that detoured through the industrial side of town. The streets grew darker and the buildings more sparse. The rhythmic patter of rain on the windows seemed deafening in the growing tension. She decided to stay calm. "Oh, I see. Could you just follow the GPS? I'm not in a rush, and I'd feel more comfortable sticking to the main roads," she said, trying to keep her tone light. John didn't reply. Instead, he slowed the car abruptly, pulling over near an abandoned warehouse. The engine idled as the wipers squeaked against the windshield. "Why are we stopping?" Emily asked, her voice trembling now. John turned around slowly, his unblinking eyes meeting hers. "Needed to check something," he said cryptically, before stepping out of the car and leaving the door slightly ajar. Emily's heart pounded as she watched him walk around to the trunk, disappearing from view. Every horror story she'd ever heard about rideshares flooded her mind. She quickly opened her phone, her fingers trembling as she pretended to make a call. "Hey, yeah, I'm almost home," she said loudly, her voice shaky but firm. "I'm in the Uber now, and I just shared my location with you. Should be there in about 5 minutes. Oh, and yeah, I see the cops near the intersection up ahead." "That's good." Her bluff seemed to work. John reappeared, his face momentarily registering surprise before he climbed back into the driver's seat. Without a word, he pulled the car back onto the road. Emily noticed that his driving had become erratic, and he was glancing nervously at her phone. Emily kept her call going, occasionally adding phrases like, "Yeah, I see your text," or "I'll let you know if I need anything." She wanted to make it seem like someone was tracking her every move. As they approached a more populated area, Emily spotted a gas station with bright lights and a few parked cars. She knew this was her chance. "Actually, can you pull over here? I need to grab something," she said, pointing to the gas station. John hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We're almost there." "No need to stop," he said, his voice lower than before. Emily's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "I really need to stop. It's important," she insisted. After a tense pause, John finally pulled into the gas station. The moment the car stopped, Emily grabbed her bag and jumped out, not even waiting for the car to come to a complete halt. She sprinted into the brightly lit convenience store and immediately asked the cashier for help, explaining the situation. The cashier called the police while Emily watched from the window. John's car idled for a few moments before speeding off into the night. When the police arrived, Emily provided all the details she could remember: the car's make and model, the license plate number, and John's description. She later found out that John's account had been flagged before for suspicious behavior, but had not been deactivated due to insufficient evidence. The incident left Emily shaken but grateful that she had trusted her instincts and acted quickly. She never took another rideshare alone at night, and she always shared her ride details with friends and family. Emily's quick thinking and bravery likely saved her life that night. Remember, safety comes first. Always trust your gut and take precautions when using rideshare services. Have you ever experienced something similar? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true scary stories. It was a crisp autumn evening when Thomas, a part-time Lyft driver, logged into his app to pick up some late-night fares. The streets were busy with the usual nightlife crowd, but as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the city began to quiet down. Thomas had just dropped off a passenger and was about to call it a night when he received another request. The pickup location was a few blocks away, outside an old theater that had long been abandoned. When Thomas arrived, the street was dimly lit by a single flickering street lamp. A woman stood on the curb, dressed in a flowing white dress that seemed oddly out of place for the chilly weather. Her long, dark hair obscured her face, and she stood unervingly still, as if she had been waiting for him for hours. Thomas hesitated for a moment but reminded himself that he'd seen plenty of eccentric passengers before. He rolled down the window and called out, "Hi, are you Amanda?" The woman nodded silently and opened the back door, slipping into the seat behind him without a word. The air inside the car grew noticeably colder, and Thomas felt a sudden unease he couldn't explain. Brushing it off, he glanced at the app to confirm the destination, a residential address on the outskirts of town. "All right, we're headed to Maplewood Drive. Should take about 20 minutes, Thomas said, trying to fill the silence. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed out the window. Thomas adjusted his rearview mirror to get a better look at her, but her face remained obscured by her hair. Her posture was rigid, and she clutched a small handbag tightly in her lap. As Thomas drove, the silence in the car became oppressive. Even the usual hum of the engine and the soft music from the radio felt muted. Thomas attempted to strike up a conversation again. "Long night?" he asked, trying to sound casual. This time, the woman turned her head slightly, enough for him to catch a glimpse of her pale skin. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Chills ran down Thomas's spine. Something about her tone sent a wave of unease through him. He decided to focus on the road and get the ride over with as quickly as possible. About halfway to the destination, Thomas noticed something strange. The woman's reflection in the rearview mirror seemed wrong. Her features appeared blurry and distorted, as though the glass couldn't quite capture her image. He glanced back at her directly, and she looked as normal as she had when she entered. Thomas's heart began to race. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe he was just tired, or the lighting in the car was playing tricks on him. The road grew darker as they left the city, the streetlights becoming sparse. They passed an old cemetery, and Thomas couldn't help but notice the woman's slight movement. She turned her head toward the graveyard, her gaze lingering there until it was out of sight. "Almost there," Thomas said, his voice shaky. Suddenly, the GPS app rerouted, instructing him to take a detour down a narrow, tree-lined road. The path was dark, with overgrown branches forming a tunnel overhead. Thomas hesitated but decided to follow the new route, figuring it might save time. As he drove deeper into the wooded area, a sense of dread washed over him. The woman hadn't moved or spoken since her last whisper. The cold in the car grew more intense, and Thomas noticed his breath forming clouds in the air, as though it were freezing inside. Unable to take the silence any longer, Thomas glanced back and said, "Are you sure this is the right way?" This time, the woman turned fully toward him. Her face was pale and expressionless, but her eyes seemed unnaturally dark, as if they were endless voids. Thomas's hands shook on the wheel as she leaned forward slightly and whispered, "It's where I need to go." Before Thomas could respond, the car's radio crackled with static, and the headlights flickered. The engine sputtered briefly but kept running. Thomas's panic reached a peak as he realized the GPS had frozen, the screen now displaying an error message. "Something's wrong?" Thomas stammered, pulling the car over to the side of the road. He turned to face the back seat, but the woman was gone. The door was still closed, and the seatbelt was fastened, as though she had never been there. Thomas's heart pounded as he stepped out of the car, shining his phone's flashlight into the surrounding woods. "Hello? Amanda?" he called out, his voice echoing into the darkness. There was no response, only the rustling of leaves in the cold wind. Thomas returned to the car, locking the doors and trying to calm his racing mind. He decided to drive back toward the main road, abandoning the detour. As he reached the edge of the wooded area, the GPS suddenly resumed, rerouting him back to his starting location. Confused and shaken, Thomas checked the app. The ride had been marked as completed, and the payment processed. When he reviewed his ride history, the passenger's name and destination were gone, replaced by an error message. Later, Thomas shared his experience with a few friends who were also rideshare drivers. One of them mentioned an urban legend about a ghostly passenger who hailed rides near the old theater. According to the story, she was a spirit searching for her way home after a tragic accident years ago. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he had encountered something otherworldly that night. Though he continued driving for Lyft, he avoided that part of town and refused to take late-night rides alone. It was an ordinary night for Josh, a 28-year-old Uber Eats driver working the late shift in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Deliveries were slow, and the cold, misty air made the streets eerily empty. Just as he considered calling it a night, his app buzzed with a new request. A pickup from The Last Bite, a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. The destination was listed as 133 Willow Lane, a house on the outskirts of a wooded area. Josh accepted the request, happy for one last job to round out his shift. When he arrived at the diner, the order was already waiting. A plain brown paper bag, tied neatly with string. Josh noticed something odd right away. The bag was heavier than he expected, and the name on the receipt simply read, Midnight. He shrugged it off, assuming it was just a quirky nickname, and placed the bag in his car. The GPS guided Josh through winding streets, away from the bustling town and into an increasingly desolate area. The houses grew farther apart, the streetlights became sparse, and the dense woods loomed closer on either side of the road. Josh began to feel uneasy. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of his car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. To distract himself, he turned on the radio, but static filled the speakers. He changed the station, but every channel was the same. Static and faint, garbled voices that sent chills down his spine. The mist thickened as he approached 133 Willow Lane. The GPS announced his arrival, but when Josh stopped, he saw no house. Instead, a dirt path stretched into the woods, barely visible in the dim glow of his headlights. He checked the app again. The location was correct, but there was no sign of a mailbox or any indication of a residence. "This has to be a mistake," Josh muttered to himself. He considered canceling the delivery but remembered the hefty penalties for undelivered orders. With a sigh, he grabbed the bag and stepped out of the car. The air was icy, and the mist clung to Josh as he walked cautiously down the dirt path. The forest was unnervingly quiet, with only the crunch of leaves under his boots breaking the silence. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, but when he turned, there was nothing there. After walking for what felt like an eternity, Josh spotted a faint light in the distance. As he got closer, the outline of a decrepit old house emerged. A two-story structure that looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. The light came from a single lantern hanging by the front door. Josh's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he forced himself to keep going. Deliver the food, get paid, and leave, he thought, clutching the paper bag tightly. The front porch creaked under Josh's weight as he stepped onto it. The door was ancient, its paint peeling, and a brass knocker shaped like a claw gleamed faintly in the lantern light. Josh knocked twice. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. From inside, he heard faint, shuffling footsteps. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a man shrouded in darkness. His face was barely visible, but what Josh could see made his stomach churn. Sunken eyes, sallow skin, and a strange, unsettling smile. "You must be the delivery boy," the man rasped, his voice dry and cracked like old parchment. Josh nodded, handing over the bag. "Yeah, your food." From the last bite, the man took the bag but didn't move to close the door. Instead, he stared at Josh, his grin widening unnaturally. "You've been very helpful," the man said, his tone dripping with something Josh couldn't place. Gratitude, menace, or both? Josh took a step back. "All right, well, have a good night." He turned to leave, but the man's voice stopped him. "Wait," the man called. "There's a tip for you." Josh hesitated. He needed the money but didn't want to spend another second near the house. Against his better judgment, he turned back. The man held out an envelope, his bony fingers trembling slightly. Josh took it quickly and muttered a thanks, not daring to look the man in the eye. As he walked back to his car, he felt the man's gaze burning into his back. Once inside the safety of his car, Josh opened the envelope. Inside was a single bill, a crisp $100 note. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. As Josh started the engine, he glanced in his rearview mirror and froze. The man was standing at the edge of the woods, illuminated faintly by his brake lights. His figure was unnaturally still, his head tilted slightly as if observing Josh with an intense curiosity. Josh floored the accelerator, the tires screeching on the dirt road as he sped away. His heart pounded as he glanced back, but the man was gone. Back in town, Josh stopped at a gas station to collect himself. The encounter had shaken him, but he was determined to put it behind him. Curious about the envelope, he pulled it out again. That's when he noticed the back of the $100 bill. Scrawled in faint red ink were the words, "See you soon." A chill ran down his spine. He looked around the gas station, suddenly feeling exposed. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long under the fluorescent lights, and every sound felt amplified. Josh jumped back into his car and drove home, locking every door and window behind him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, and for weeks afterward, he avoided late-night deliveries.